Welcome to Atheist Talk on KTNF, AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Good morning to all of you joining us locally by radio and streaming online. We appreciate you tuning in. Today is Sunday, April 14th. My name is Maddie Love, and with me in studio is Hertzie Hertz and Rachel Lenz. We are excited to be joined via Skype by Dr. Karen Stollznow. Karen is the author of numerous books, including her bestseller, God Bless America, Language, Myths, Mysteries, and Magic, Haunting America, and her latest book, Would You Believe It? When she's not writing, Karen also teaches at several universities, has worked as a consultant linguist for several major companies, writes a blog focusing on language with a focus on myths and misconceptions. And with all of that, Dr. Karen Stollznow still finds time to co-host the award-winning science-based podcast Monster Talk, where she and her co-host Blake Smith look at the legends and facts surrounding Bigfoot, sea monsters, ghosts, cryptid, and other things that go bump in the night. This is an open conversation. We welcome and encourage listener interaction with your phone calls to 952-946-6205, your emails to radio@mnatheist.org, or tweet us at Atheist Talk. Karen, thank you so much for joining us on a chilly spring morning here in Minnesota. Or not.
Hello.
Well, our sound engineer is working on some technical difficulties.
We can talk about the chill.
The chill. It is... I am so happy that I got to wake up this morning and enjoy a crisp spring morning instead of the gorgeous sunny morning that I was expecting.
Yeah,
Not really.
Second winter is kind of tough.
Yeah, we went to the opening of Allianz Field, the soccer stadium, yesterday. I dressed in 4 layers and had mittens and the scarves that I usually wear just like to show team support and to twirl around and stuff. No, the scarf was on to keep me warm, and then the other scarf was decorative. So I grew up in the area where that field was built and such. So it's always been kind of an odd thing for me to see it when I go driving by it, because I'm like,
It seemed to just pop out of nowhere, actually, because, I mean, I don't drive by that often, but every time I did drive by, it seemed like, oh my gosh, they just.
Oh yeah, I was at work one day, and one of the people was talking about how. They're like, oh, yeah, it used to be this vacant lot forever and ever. And I'm like, okay, no, it was not a vacant lot. Right. Like, and admittedly, this is...
A lot of it was parking lot.
Yeah. But about 20 years ago, what ended up happening is it was a bus depot for Metro Transit. Oh. And it was actually a big garage. A lot of people used it. Huh. I do believe, though, we now have Karen.
Do we have Karen on now?
I think so.
Yay! Technical difficulties solved thanks to our fantastic and marvelous studio sound engineer, Eric.
Mischief.
No worries. That sounds like the start of any episode of Monster Talk.
Oh, really? Oh. Because see, but you also have the benefit of just, editing that out.
That is true. That's true for a podcast. But, hey.
We were live for 15 million people, which is a total lie about the Minneapolis numbers.
I was going to say 5. We have 5 listeners.
That is not true.
I know.
So I was listening to the commercials, and then everything just went dead, and I thought, oh, okay, this is just some kind of prelude. I'm not sure. I just went with it.
No, I had this big, long introduction for you, and I'm going to keep all that because it had a lot of nice things about it, because you are pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That is very kind.
And
I wish I'd heard it.
Oh, well, I just talked about all the books that you have and
how smart you are.
Yeah, the fact that you teach. Yeah.
You've built me up too much.
All right, so first question out of the gate, because I'm a little curious. I understand what the word linguistics means, sort of, I think. But what exactly does a linguist do?
Well, linguists do lots of different things. And funnily enough, about a year ago, I published a paper for an academic journal called Lingua. And it was entitled, oh, you're a linguist, how many languages do you speak? And because that's a question that I encounter all the time, and most linguists do as well. So linguistics is the science of language. So linguists can study lots of different things. Some do speak lots of languages. Typically, the formal term for that is polyglot, so someone who speaks lots of languages, works in translation, interpretation, that kind of thing. So linguists can work with phonology, they can work with semantics like I do, they can work with sociolinguistics, morphology, so various aspects of language. And some of that can be research-based, some of that can be teaching. So linguists do lots of different things, and I think just like many academic pursuits, a lot of people don't know, or lay people don't know what a linguist does as a rule, because it's just very specific academic scholarly stuff to do with language.
So you help out on Monster Talk, and how exactly does linguistics, everything that you just talked about or spoke about, how does that play into a study of cryptozoology or monsters?
I wouldn't say that it always does. I think often we might talk about linguistic aspects. We might have a guest on the show who talks about a specific monster and might talk about the etymology, the origins of the name for this creature. We might talk about maybe sociolinguistic aspects, so of a particular monster. We might talk about. I won't say it's linguistic focused at all. I think that my background in skepticism really comes into play a lot more. And certainly if you ask me a really specific question, a kind of trivia question about language, I might not be able to answer it. It would be something that I could research easily, but I might not know off the top of my head. So, I'd say we always talk about language. We always talk about communication. It comes into play, but it's not really a focus for the show.
One of your most recent books, The Language of Discrimination, looks an awfully lot like a textbook, or at least Amazon has a price like one.
For the price, absolutely. Yeah, that's $177, I think, at last view. So I've got sorry to interrupt, I've got a trade version of that, which is going to be coming out hopefully soon, which is called Why Is That Offensive? So, The Language of Discrimination absolutely is based on my PhD dissertation, and it's unreadable, I can tell you. Uses a methodology that maybe less than 100 people use worldwide, and so it's not readable, but this version hopefully will be. Because
just looking at it, atheists often talk about, discrimination that we face in Christian privilege, and many of us involved in the atheist talk are women, and Minnesota Atheists as a huge group of, involved with the LGBTQIA community.
Right.
So could you take a few moments and pretend like we're underperforming students who need help understanding why, understanding what your dissertation is about, or what this book is about, or what the book that you said is going to be released shortly that will be readable.
Maddie, I didn't realize you had access to my grades.
And mine. But the Language of Discrimination, the academic book, that, as I said, it uses a methodology called natural semantic metalanguage. So that's just not worth getting into. But this book is really more of an overview of discrimination, prejudice, intolerance, bias, bigotry. And I look at that from many different angles. So there's a chapter on racism, there's a chapter on sexism, there's a chapter on ageism, there's a chapter on lookism. So I look at all the different areas of discrimination and prejudice, and I kind of have a hook for each chapter where I give a story that kind of gives an overview for that particular chapter. And then I go into a lot of terms and why they're offensive. It's not exhaustive in the sense that there are so many insult terms and slurs, microaggressions and terms that are offensive today. I couldn't possibly treat every single one of them in the English language, but I think I do treat a lot of them. And, I just often hear that as a question, why is that offensive? You might hear that from Republicans or, people who just wonder why particular terms could, or even denying that they're offensive. Well, that's not offensive. Making decisions for other people. So I just go into the etymology that a lot of terms, historical terms, have baggage. And so I look at what the origins of the word is and what it once meant and what it means today, the ramifications of the words, and take examples, case studies from, contemporary incidents, maybe in politics or just things that celebrities say, and again, why they're offensive. And so I think it's really very explanatory, but I think that it's written for the general public, for lay people. So I'm not heavy on terminology at all like the academic version is.
Well, in language, once again, I feel like I'm such a layperson, but language evolves is my understanding. And I guess part of that, like when you're talking about definitions, most of our regular listeners are up to speed. But for those tuning into AM 950 KTNF for the first time as they drive to church this morning, can you explain what you mean when you use that label, when you use the label skeptic to define yourself? And as I ask you that question, I realize I only have like a minute and a half before we go to break.
Oh. Well, I think I've always been a skeptic, and I know that there's a lot of negativity surrounding the term skeptic. It's often conflated with cynic. We find the same thing with atheists, that people just look at that as being a negative term. I think for me, being a skeptic, some people will differentiate and say, oh, you're a skeptic with a capital S, or you're a professional skeptic or something like that. I don't know what defines a professional skeptic, really. But for me, being a skeptic is about keeping an open mind, and if I'm presented with information, to question it and to do my research, to not take anything at face value, and if I'm presented with paranormal claims or pseudoscientific claims, to always look for natural explanations for phenomena rather than supernatural or paranormal ones.
Yeah, I want to get to – we're going to go to break here in just a moment, and I want to touch on – that you're talking about paranormal stuff, touch on your other book that just came out a couple years ago. So please stay with us to the break. Hertzie, Rachel, and I will return to Atheist Talk with our guest, author, researcher, and podcaster, Dr. Karen Stollznow. You're listening to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome back to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. You're tuned into Atheist Talk. I'm your host, Maddie Love, joined in studio by my co-hosts, Hertzie Hertz and Rachel Lenz. In just a moment, we'll return with our special in Skype guest, researcher, linguistic professor, and podcaster, Dr. Karen Stollznow, although she's sort of in studio because the phone for the Skype is in studio. So I don't know what you're signaling, dude.
Oh, there's a buzz. I think if you wiggle the cord a little bit.
Just jiggle it, just a little bit. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. I know you just finished listening to commercials, but I wanted to give you my weekly thank you to both Minnesota Atheist and Cucumbers Restaurant in Edina for their support of Atheist Talk. I consider myself a scientific skeptic, so when I was told about how extraordinary the buffet was at Cucumbers Restaurant, I was open-minded but needed some evidence. So I made a short, easy trek to France Avenue. Why are you laughing, Artsy? Between 494 and Highway 62 to gather some empirical evidence to test this claim. What I discovered after numerous tests of the buffet and salad bar, I can't even finish this. But honestly, Cucumbers is great. You surely
Oh my
go
gosh,
eat
it's
there.
so delicious.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, Cucumbers is one of our sponsors, but they really are awesome, and we wish to thank them for their continued support. If you'd like to advertise in this program and keep us on the air, please contact us at radio@mnatheist.org. And now back to Dr. Karen Stollznow. If you'd like to get involved in the conversation, you can call us at 952-946-6205. Email us at radio@mnatheist.org or tweet us at Atheist Talk. And thank you so much for putting up with us, Karen. Oh, and we have lost Karen again.
After you've asked for
Oh,
There.
I was really worried there. I don't know why we're having so many technical difficulties today, because this is normally not something we deal with. I don't know. All right, so
We can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you now.
You can hear me. Okay,
Yes.
good.
All right, so before we went to break, I wanted to talk about your most recent book, the one that's just meant for ordinary folks like myself, that they can pick up from their local bookstore. Would you believe it? Mysterious Tales from People You'd Least Expect. And it had me wondering two things before I even opened it. The first was, is Karen going to share a bunch of stuff that didn't make the cut over at Monster Talk? And the second is, what kind of people are we talking about here, like that I would least expect? So how would you answer those questions that I had before I even opened the book?
Okay, well, people you'd least expect. I'm talking about skeptics. I'm talking about atheists. I'm talking about critical thinkers. So people like the mentalist Banachek, Joan Nickel, the skeptical investigator, Eugenie Scott. I'm sure these names are familiar to a lot of listeners. George Schwab. You were talking about Jeb Card, so Ken Feder. He's been a guest on Monster Talk a number of times. So the people you'd least expect, basically people that don't believe in the paranormal by and large. So I'm sorry, what was the other question?
So the stuff that you share, is it just like some of the stuff that I might find over at Monster Talk, or are they more stories that, like, in a different genre?
Well, it's not monster related necessarily. There are a few stories that contributors have written about their alleged encounters with alien big cats and things like that. So they are animal, non-human animal related. But by and large, their stories, I mean, I'll tell you how I got into this in the first place. Doing interviews over the years, especially with paranormal shows, I'll always be asked, have you experienced anything paranormal yourself? And I was always want to say, no, I haven't experienced anything. And then in talking with other skeptics and hearing about their interesting stories of all different kinds of seemingly paranormal phenomena that they experience, which has ultimately natural, normal explanations, I thought it would be interesting to get in contact with a number of my friends and ask them if they've had any personal experiences which they can explain or can't explain. So, for example, one friend, Steve Cuno, who's a fellow author, he was a Mormon for a number of years, and he believed once that he'd cured a woman of a cancerous tumor that she had. And so he describes that story basically of how he became a Mormon and how he was a missionary. So he was going from house to house and preaching as they do, and came across a woman who had a tumor and had been diagnosed with cancer. And he did a number of healing sessions with her, and then suddenly she was apparently cured. So he then delves into the true explanations behind that and what actually, I mean, he doesn't know for certain what happened, but what may have happened, that it might have been a misdiagnosis, or she might not have been diagnosed at all. But basically, this is just a collection of fun stories of ghost apparitions and UFO sightings, Bigfoot sightings, all different kinds of experiences that on the surface people would think were paranormal, and then the possible explanations for what truly happened. And often there is an explanation for these stories, and then sometimes there isn't. With a few stories, there are just question marks, and I think that that's a great illustration of skepticism in general, that we don't always know how to explain things, but that doesn't mean that there's necessarily a paranormal explanation.
So you share a story of your own, which is about grief hallucinations, and
yes.
Is that a common phenomenon? Because I've never heard of grief hallucinations, or at least I haven't heard of it described that way.
Yeah, some people call them bereavement hallucinations, and I've read a number of studies that say between 20 to 80% of people who lose a loved one will experience them after they've died in some way. So whether it's smelling maybe your grandmother's perfume after she's passed, or hearing your partner's voice when they've died, or even seeing an apparition of a person. So there are a few grief hallucination stories in the book, and they are apparently very common. And it's really the kind of, if you're living with a person and you're experiencing them every day, and then suddenly they're gone, and you're living in the same house, it can be very easy to imagine, to hallucinate that they're sitting in their favorite armchair, or they're doing things that they used to do around the house, to hear them in some way. People even have grief hallucinations when they lose a pet, a dog or a cat, and they might think that they hear the animal, the cat meowing or the dog scratching or something like that. So it is just a very common psychological phenomena, because it's very difficult to accept the loss of someone, and in many ways you want to see them again, you want to have a final experience with them. So it's a very common thing.
Would you say it's similar to like a more profound version of phantom limb syndrome?
And I do compare it to that. So I think that it is it's a related phenomenon, not the same thing, but that it's similar to that.
So we only have about a minute before we're going to break, and I just wanted to mention one of the things I really loved about all of the stories in this book is even the unexplained ones, like people like Joe Nickel. The tone of every story and the way that they're telling it is not one of mocking. Like they're not. If I shared that I had this weird experience, like I had a ghost story, none of these people would mock me. They're just gonna. They're not. I'm not going to convince them that I saw a ghost. Like I don't believe I've ever seen a ghost, but they would say, "Oh, you actually experienced something. Tell me more about it." And I thought that was a really good overall tone to the entire book.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to attribute some of that to editing. I think there were a few stories along the way which had that kind of mocking tone. But I think that the sheer fact that people have had these pseudo-paranormal experiences, which should really humble us and to make us realize that it doesn't make you stupid to have these experiences, that everyone really has them. It's a matter of how you interpret them.
All right. Well, we'll return to our guest, author, podcaster, and doctor of linguistics right after this short commercial break. Please stay with us. I'm Maddie Love with Hertzie Hertz and Rachel Lenz, and you're listening to Atheist Talk on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Thank you for tuning in to Atheist Talk on AM 950 KTNF. I'm your host, Maddie Love, in studio with Hertzie Hertz and Rachel Lenz. We are chatting via Skype with Dr. Karen Stollznow. Dr. Stollznow is the author of numerous books, is a doctor of linguistics, and is co-host of the popular podcast Monster Talk, a science show about monsters. If you'd like to chat with us this morning, you can call us at 952-946-6205, email us radio@mnatheist.org, or tweet us at Atheist Talk. Before we return to Karen, I wanted to thank our group of dedicated volunteers and the generous donations of you, our listeners. You help keep Atheist Talk in the air and in podcast form. If you are able to help with a donation, please consider doing so at our Radio Fund page or our Patreon, where you can get extended interviews over at patreon.com/atheisttalk. Minnesota Atheist is a 501c3 tax-deductible organization. We couldn't do the show without you, and we deeply appreciate your support. Music for Atheist Talk is by composer and member Brent Michael Davids and is used with permission. Please note all opinions are of the guests and hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the Minnesota Atheist Organization. Mischief managed. Let's get back to Dr. Karen Stollznow. So, Karen, going into the break, we were chatting about your book and about all the super awesome stories that are in here. I actually had my own weird ghostly experience that I wanted to share because, why not?
I'd love to hear it.
And it's, to be fair, after reading your book, it is nothing like awesome, like these really cool experiences like these. But for me, so I was just sitting in my living room and just watching TV or studying. I don't even remember now what I was doing because I know memory is terrible. But what I do remember is watching or seeing somebody in black run from my bedroom into the kitchen, which was just on my right side, just right in the periphery of my vision. We didn't have cats at the time. There's nobody else in the house. And it's like, I know there was nobody there, but I had to get up and go look because I know that I saw something. But the rational part of me is there was nobody there. You just had a hallucination. And it's I'd never had a hallucination before. So I always was trying to be charitable when people tell me about, I saw this. And it's oh, I know you did. You think you did, whatever. And then I got done. I was oh, yeah, I understand why somebody who's especially going through a strong hallucination can, really believe that what's happening is true. And I find that I'm now in a position where I'm even more charitable and generous when I hear people tell me stories where it's I need to not mock you because I can see why you believe that.
Absolutely. And you could have a hallucination like that for any reason. It could be that you're very tired. It could be that you're sick in some way, that you're on medication. It can be lots of different reasons. But I think a lot of paranormal people would interpret your story as being a shadow person. Oh. So I think that's a paranormal explanation anyway. But as a skeptic, I would say that that's probably a case of pareidolia, that you've seen something out of the corner of your eye and your brain is just trying to make sense of that and to interpret that random stimuli as being something familiar. So it's like seeing faces or pictures of things in the clouds. There are a lot of fun websites nowadays. You can go and look up pareidolia and you've got lots of inanimate objects that look like faces and people. So it's supposed to be one of those kind of evolutionary traits that we have to be able to see the human face and recognize human features in inanimate objects, to recognize dangers, basically. But I just still think that's a fun story. And I think some of the stories are rather short and we just go into a lot more information about exactly what's going on. So I think everyone's got a good story.
Was it hard to get stories like this from people that are known to promote, who stake their reputation on promoting science and reason, and they spend their time arguing against magical thinking?
That's a really good question, and I had a lot of more moderate skeptics, so people like Eugenie Scott, who I think would classify herself as being more of a humanist. And people like Banachek, the mentalist, who were like, oh, sure, yeah, absolutely, all humans had these experiences. They've got a good grounding in psychology. But certainly there were some skeptics who will go nameless that had their reputations to uphold, and they thought that this was somehow going to make them fall off their pedestals. So even though they had experiences, like me initially, they were interpreting those or reinterpreting those as being natural, and couldn't look at them from that perspective. So they were very reluctant to share those stories with me and didn't want them to go public. But it seems like there is a conclusion written by the psychologist. I'm trying to think, is it a university in Canada? James Alcock, and he talks about how everyone will have these experiences, and he's been teaching classes in critical thinking for decades. And he, funnily enough, couldn't think of an experience himself, but he said, I do teach to my students that everyone will have these kinds of experiences. They're human experiences.
Is it just that certain people are more inclined, if you already believe in magic, now you're going to see this experience and then like remember it, whereas like I might have an experience like this and just like write it off as, I rationalized it away, and then I didn't remember it ever again because it wasn't important to me.
Absolutely, and that was what was happening to me. I think a lot of it is about socialization too. If you're raised in a family where the family might be religious, they might be superstitious, then you might be prone to interpreting these experiences as paranormal, supernatural somehow. Whereas if you're raised in more of a secular household, you might have these experiences and talk to your friends and family about them, and they might give you more rational explanations. You might do some Googling and find out rational explanations for what happened. But I think a lot of it is just personal interpretation. Some people want to hold these experiences as being paranormal and will repeat them that way. And then you were talking about memory being faulty. Often in the retelling, a lot of these stories become more paranormal too.
Was there anyone in this book that, did share a story, but when you reached out to them, you were like, they're never going to respond to this?
And you were surprised that they did.
I would say all of them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I really thought that no one would want to be seen in this light. I didn't think anyone that I'd contacted would want to share their stories to the public. So I was just very, very pleased to get all of these stories and this positive feedback from so many wonderful people I really respect. So,
would you be okay with taking a caller who wants to share an experience with us?
Absolutely. Please.
All right. So we have Brian in Plymouth. Brian, thanks so much for calling Atheist Talk.
Yes. What I want to mention is that sometimes when people see something, it's not in their imagination, or is there a good explanation that you can explain it away? And I could give you one. It was January of '63. I was in college. I was going down 52, which is now 94. And anyway, long story short, I thought my engine was going to throw a rod because it was going clunk, 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 clunk. And before this happened, the guy said he'd follow me to make sure I got home or back to the, off-campus housing. And he was following me. And he took off and went in front of me to take his girlfriend home on the Clearwater exit. It wasn't an exit back in those days because it wasn't a freeway. Anyway, I was driving along. My wife was sitting beside me. I wasn't married to her at the time. And she had a roommate in the other side, and the roommate was sleeping. And I looked at my wife, and I said, gee, the moon looks huge. And there was this big round object in front of my windshield. And she said, that's not the moon. The moon's over there. That was the left side. And at the time, I thought that was the moon. I don't think that was the moon either. So the engine was going clunk, 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 clunk. I thought I was going to throw a rod. I was only going 20 miles an hour. It's as though I was had something that this UFO was one where I was going so slowly. I had that feeling after. So I pulled to the side. We watched this thing come over my car, about 300 feet above me, and the color changed from orange to white to green. There was haze underneath it. And I didn't see any little green man or orange man. I didn't see any portholes in the bottom. My watch didn't lose time. I didn't want to. I'm not embellishing this story. I'm just saying what happened. And we watched it for about 5 minutes. It was about 300 feet right above me. And I was almost certain the thing was, what the heck is this guy going so slowly for? Well, it turned out I had the wrong spark plugs in the engine. Long story short, anyway, he finally took off, and then you could see it was a disc because the round spherical shape changed to a disc. Now, I've been an atheist all my life, and I know there's a lot of Andy Warholists, I would say, in our world who want their 15 minutes of fame. But my wife, whenever I mentioned this, she didn't want me to even talk about it to other people because they thought, well, you're one of those UFO nutcases. And I'm not a nutcase. I saw this thing. I'm not giving you a story. I'm not embellishing it or anything. There are times when things actually are true, and you have witnesses. We live in an awful big cosmos.
That's true. Brian, we're gonna finish taking your call off air, and we'll chat about it. Thank you so much for calling in.
Okay, I'm going to go off the air.
Okay. So, Karen, like, when I hear that story, and you do handle more, like, stories of the paranormal than I obviously do. What I hear is somebody who had an honest-to-goodness experience. I totally believe that he had this experience, but I'm not willing to believe yet because I don't have enough evidence that it might be aliens. But, like, I totally believe that he experienced something.
I don't know if you saw in our chats on the side, I just mentioned that I couldn't hear him at all.
Oh, no. So he had a fantastic experience, and I'll quick sum up that, he was driving down the road, he was having some car trouble, and he had essentially he saw this huge light in front of his car, right on his the hood of his car, and this was back. It was back in the 60s, but I'm going to not make that joke because he sounded like he was this was not like anything related to that. But he actually had this experience, and he's talking about, I've been an atheist my whole life. I don't believe in a lot of extra stuff, but at the same time, the world is so huge and complicated, and the cosmos is so big. It's like, okay, well, I had this experience, so I don't know. It's just I hear that, and I actually enjoy hearing stories like that. I just come to a different conclusion.
Absolutely. And I wish I'd heard the story, but I have heard similar stories before. And as you say, not having been there, it's really difficult to say what happened. So it's a great story in and of itself, but it's something we can't really replicate. I mean, we might be able to replicate it under certain conditions if we had some theories as to what was actually happening. So really the best that we can do at this point, I see a lot of skeptics who will say, oh, I've solved this. This is what happened. And I just think to take that blanket approach is the kind of thing that makes people call us naysayers and to say that we're cynics. I think that really you could cite possible explanations for something like that, but you can't definitively say this is what happened. So I think it's great just as a dinner party story or for Sunday morning radio to be able to talk about.
Yeah.
But, I wouldn't say whether it's paranormal or not, probably not. But just not being able to go through and state exactly what happens. It's just a fun story.
Yeah, and I know, I've heard, I've had Dr. Joel Nickel on Monster Talk, and you were interviewing him, and he was talking about how, you can write off somebody's story, or you can go investigate, and if you're able to, based on the facts.
Right.
And how I remember one where you're talking about people were complaining about noises next door, and they just kept getting, there's no ghosts. He went and investigated, and it's like, oh, look, there's a washing machine next door. But these people were actually hearing something. They weren't making it up. It wasn't a hallucination. Anyway, I've only actually got 15 seconds before we go to break.
So that's a good point.
We'll return to our guest, Karen Stollznow, right after this short commercial break. I'm Maddie Love in studio with Hertzy Hertz and Rachel Lenz. You're listening to Atheist Talk on KTNF, AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome back to AM 950, KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. You're tuned into Atheist Talk. I'm your host, Maddie Love, and I'm joined in studio by Hertzy Hertz and Rachel Lenz. We are happy to be joined via Skype by podcaster, author, and linguistic doctor Karen Stollznow. Karen, thank you so much for sticking around through the break.
Oh, no worries.
So, I do want to keep sharing. We've had more listeners like this last one sent us a message talking about that they're wanting to share some stories that they've gone through. But before we do that, I wanted to take a minute to have you talk about you have another book of yours, Unforeseen Circumstances. Don't Leave Me. I have not bought this book. What is this book about?
They're actually two separate short stories.
Okay.
And I think long before I was interested in skepticism or knew what skepticism was, I was just interested in horror and the paranormal. And so now when I have a week or two off here and there, I just like to put together a short story. And so those you can get those on Amazon. I think they're 99 cents or something each. And I'm hoping eventually to compile a number of them, maybe 13 or something, into a book. But I'm working on another one now that I hope to have out in about a week, which is called I Am Me, which is about doppelgangers.
Oh.
And so Unforeseen Circumstances is about long story, really, but they're paranormal, ghost stories, horror stories, and so it's just another side love that I have.
I will buy that anthology.
Yes. I'm actually multitasking right now, and I'm going on Amazon to buy two more.
Yeah, the only reason I am not going on Amazon right now is because I have Dell's question on my Facebook on my phone, and I don't want to lose it because Dell is listening, and if I do lose it, they're going to be sad. So Farmer Dell, who's been a guest on the show a couple of times and has the Evidence-Based Eating podcast, which is awesome, has the question, has anyone shared they quote-unquote tricked someone into thinking they had a paranormal experience, either by accident or on purpose? Did they come clean to that person they convinced? Dell apparently did this as a kid, and to this day, their mom thinks a ghost found her glasses and put them on the kitchen table. Dell has not had the heart to admit this and was too embarrassed. Great, now I feel bad.
Now her mom's going to know.
Does Dell's parents listen to this?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But this would be an interesting way for Dell to fess up.
Yeah.
But to this day, their mom brings it up as her only paranormal experience.
Oh, wow. Well, my co-host from Monster Talk, Blake Smith, we did an episode on Robert the Doll. Have you ever heard about Robert the Doll?
Yes!
I have now that I listen to Monster Talk.
Yeah.
Oh, see, I was into this stuff before.
A doll, which is on very creepy looking doll. You should go and Google a picture of it, which is on display at a museum in, I think it could be Key West or something in Florida. And people believe that the doll is cursed, and that if you take a photograph of it, that curse will be placed upon you. And anyway, if you listen to that episode, you can go back through our files and listen to it. And Blake tells a very funny story at the start in which he tricked his daughters into believing that they had a haunted doll. And I think his wife kept throwing the doll out, and he kept getting it back out of the trash, and it kept appearing. So he played that trick. So I don't.
What a jerk.
That's generally not a word I would use to describe Blake. But that does sound kind of mean.
Well, yeah, I think he's just got a funny sense of humor. I don't have any stories like that in my book, but I've certainly done some investigations in the past where I've performed hoaxes in order to kind of elicit responses from people and to be able to see what would happen. So I think I've done an interview about this. It would be a show within itself that I could do with my husband sometime too, in which we, because he once belonged to a ghost hunting group in Denver, and but it was more skeptical, a group that does investigations and research rather than being ghost busters and ghost hunters. But we basically hoaxed another group who I think point was that we were trying to show that it's dangerous to go to these ghost hunting groups and to invite them into your home, and that their interpretations will invariably be that you are haunted, that you have ghost activity. And so we basically teamed up with a friend of ours who is a lawyer, district attorney actually, locally, and just invited this group into the home and gave them a story, and they found a ton of ghosts. In fact, they said this place is more haunted than Amityville. They said they found 80 ghosts or something.
Oh, my.
They did EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, and they recorded all of these sounds like, don't choke me and I'm dying. And I mean, there was absolutely nothing there that we're aware of, but we just, I guess, in a sense, it's a kind of priming to say, come and check out my house. I think that it's haunted. That's really enough for people who believe. But so I have performed hoaxes, but these people aren't necessarily aware of what we did.
Yeah, I wonder how many times
danger.
Sorry, I wonder how many times ghost hunters go to houses that people call them and they say, no, your house isn't haunted.
I think
never?
With our group, historically, we'd go and we'd give natural explanations. Oh, well,
Sure.
You've got an electrical problem. You've got a plumbing problem. You've got coyotes outside, and to provide possible natural explanations anyway. But most of these groups, and we did a study a few years ago, there were maybe about 150 ghost hunting groups in Denver alone.
Wow.
And they pretty much invariably tell you that your place is haunted,
Right.
because that suits their bias and their beliefs.
Right.
I guess that's the way to keep the spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She couldn't make it through one podcast episode without a bad pun.
Oh, yeah. So I did actually show Maddie and Rachel the Robert doll. I do have to laugh, though, because there's another doll that is haunted, and that's the Annabelle doll.
Did you, when you said haunted, you used the air quotes, right?
Yes, I did use air quotes.
Okay.
I didn't actually do air quotes, but the implied air
Yes,
quotes.
yes.
Anyways, but there's the Annabelle doll, and that one actually makes me laugh the hardest because, whenever you think about it, you think like one of those creepy porcelain dolls. And if you look, there's movies now where they have the creepy porcelain doll. And then when you actually find the doll, because it's in a museum, it's a Raggedy Ann doll.
Oh.
That... At least I know I had one when in the 80s.
Yes.
And I'm like,
So did I.
Yeah. It's like, it's the least scariest thing I can think of.
Unless you had my doll, because I can't even remember, it's going back so far. I was maybe 4 or 5. And we had a Raggedy Ann doll that was delivered to us for me. I don't know who it came from. But when we opened it up, when customs opened it up, so it went through customs, it was full of some kind of bug. Like these bugs were eating this thing alive. So to this day, I don't know truly what happened, who had sent this doll to me, and what it was infested with. But so I think that's far more scary, to be honest.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That is definitely more scary because that actually has real life consequences.
Right.
And Maddie's pointing.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing to let you know that we have 30 seconds left, and we are going to have to unfortunately end the show. Thank you for tuning in to Atheist Talk. We'd love for you to join us again next Sunday. And remember, if you miss an episode live, you can always catch the podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. I'm proud to be on the air with Minnesota Atheists and hope you enjoyed the show. The show depends on the generous support of our members, our sponsors, and donors. Please consider supporting the show through the donation link at mnatheist.org. This has been Atheist Talk on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota.